University in Ottawa, Canada. And we have four presentations today. We will go in the order of the program. I've discussed this with the presenters ahead of time. I will introduce each of the presenter when they are to speak. And then they will have about 20 minutes each to make their presentations. Very quick question period of 5 minutes or so after each paper. That will give us a little bit of time in the end to kind of have a joint session where either the participants can ask questions or the speakers can offer final remarks, those kinds of things. I will do the very old-fashioned thing of giving you 5 minutes, 2 minutes, and then please to wrap this up. I'm having a bit of trouble seeing hands up for people to ask questions. So Marc-Olivier, who is our host, will try to manage that part, or you can just wave in your box. If I can see, then I will let you know. So without further ado, the first paper is by Dylan Brewer, who is with the Georgia Institute of Technology. Dylan.
All right, thank you very much, Andre. I'm going to get my slides up. Okay. All right, yes, so as Andre mentioned, I'm at Georgia Tech. I'm an assistant professor, and this paper is looking at changes in electricity use following COVID-19 stay-at-home behavior. So I don't need to really tell anybody what kind of a year 2020 was. We had a massive pandemic that resulted in not only just sort of the main effects of the pandemic health-wise, but also in changes in economic behavior and energy use behavior specifically. So we had this big surge in unemployment, and people have changed how they work and how they live, and people have shifted to work from home for jobs that are amenable. And these changes have had large effects on the energy sector, including in electricity. So early on during 2020, a bunch of people wrote papers noting that electricity use was down anywhere between 5 and 15% around the world. I had a paper that was part of this, and most people's results looked something like this. Basically, you could see that electricity use was kind of what we would expect it to have been based on previous years, and then suddenly went down around mid-March. And this paper is mostly in the United States. So I'm going to, well, it's 100% in the United States. So I'm going to mostly focus my attention there. So what were people thinking in their papers? People were thinking that electricity use could be a good proxy for macroeconomic health. So we only get macroeconomic indicators at very sort of long-term intermittent times. So we get unemployment numbers quarterly and the like. Maybe electricity use would be better because we can observe electricity use in real time. So that was pretty interesting. And a lot of people noted that there was potentially going to be an environmental health silver lining from the pandemic. So a paper noted that carbon emissions were down in early 2020, and a lot of people anticipated that air pollution would decline. They thought that air pollution would decline, but it was possible that a global recession could delay the adoption of energy efficient technology in 2020, kind of creating a little bit of a rebound. So what did happen now that we are through 2020? Interestingly, what happened, and these are kind of the main results of the paper, and I'll explain what these look like later, is that we did have declines in electricity use in the first 3 months of the pandemic in the United States. And then during the summer in the United States, July and August, we actually had increased electricity use relative to baseline. So this is pretty surprising to me. I thought when I went to write this paper that I would be looking at a year of less electricity use. But instead we see a strange pattern where we have increased use during the summer and also increased use in December. All right, so how do I get these data? Sorry, is there a question? No, okay. So how do I get these results? So I'm using hourly electricity consumption data from PJM, which is an electricity grid in the United States that's located in sort of the mid-Atlantic area, stretching over to the Midwest. So this electricity grid covers about 65 million people and includes major population centers of Chicago, Cleveland, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, and Washington, D.C. And so I have these hourly data from 2014 through 2020. So the main empirical challenge is knowing what would have happened in 2020 if there was no COVID-19. So to understand what the effect of COVID-19 was, we would want to ideally know at any given hour in 2020 how much electricity would have been used if people were just acting normally. So we never observe this. We only observe 2020 when we have COVID-19. So we're missing the baseline sort of electricity use. So I see this as sort of a prediction problem. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually try and predict what load would have been and use that to construct the counterfactual. So I use the K nearest neighbors matching algorithm to predict counterfactual electricity consumption. So what this looks like is I'm matching each 2020 hour in each zone of PJM with the most similar hour from 2014 to 2019. And what I'm doing is I'm matching in the same zone, hour of day, day of week, and month of year to the most similar temperature and precipitation day, which gives me the counterfactual electricity for that hour. So for an August Monday at 12 p.m., I would look at all prior August Monday at 12 p.m. hours from 2014 to 2019, and then the most similar weather hour would serve as the counterfactual consumption. And this is not sort of something that I just made up. People actually use this to forecast electricity load for sort of electricity management purposes. So this is what it looks like. So matching each hour in each zone from 2020 in the black line to 2014 to 2019 in the dashed light blue line. And so you can see that during the early part of the pandemic that we have load that is below the dashed blue line, the predicted load. And then we see that by the summer, they start to track much more closely. And a lot of these peaks actually have higher electricity consumption in 2020 than in 2019. So what's going on? Well, I also want to assure you that I'm doing a good job. So I also predicted 2019 load using 2014 to 2018. And you can see that in sort of a normal year, I can do a good job of predicting this electricity load. Okay, the results don't really change much depending on whether I also match on humidity or include more matches. They seem pretty robust to a lot of the choices that I make. So how am I going to estimate the effective interest? So we can see that it looks like there's going to be sort of decline in electricity use in the early months, and then something is going to happen in the later months. But how do I arrive at that graph that I showed you earlier? So what I did was I used a difference in predicted differences estimator in the style of a paper by Burlig et al. And so what I did was I used the matched predicted electricity load to create the first difference and divided it by that matched amount to get a percentage change in electricity consumption relative to the predicted baseline, and regress that on an indicator variable for being after March 1st, so in the pandemic. So what are these estimates doing? So each coefficient beta is going to be the difference in expected consumption. I should say it's going to be the difference in the percent change in consumption in each month of the pandemic relative to the 3 months of 2020 before the pandemic. So what this is going to do is this is going to deal with any differences that we would have seen in 2020 without COVID-19. So one of the main challenges is, what if we were going to be adopting energy efficient technologies in 2020 that was going to make 2020 look differently anyways. And so that's what this is attempting to deal with. The last sort of little thing that I do with this regression is I'm really careful about the timing. So this March 1st treatment date. So most of the state governments in the United States issued their first advisory or mandatory stay-at-home orders between the 7th and the 15th of March. But people were sort of staying at home beforehand voluntarily. And we also know that when there was news of one state staying at home, issuing a stay-at-home order, the state next door would often go ahead and also stay at home. People would do that voluntarily. So we don't really know when we should treat each state as treated. So what I did was I tested robustness to a bunch of different treatment dates, including just leaving out March 1st through March 15th, so I don't contaminate treatment with control and vice versa. So what do I get after I go ahead and leave out March 1st through March 15th in the most conservative specification is I get this pattern that I showed you before where people are using less electricity early in the pandemic, then using more electricity in the summer months, and then actually sort of getting back to normal in the fall months, September, October, November. Okay, so why did this happen? This is where the paper turns next. Why did this happen? So I have a couple of different hypotheses for why consumption could have increased. The first one is maybe people returned to relatively normal behavior after the first wave of the pandemic ended. And this could have led to something that looked like this rebound recovery. My second hypothesis is that maybe businesses had to make up for lost time and delayed contracts. So if a business was supposed to deliver a bunch of products in March or April, and they had to send workers home, then maybe they needed to make that up in the summer months, fulfill those contracts and work overtime. So think about this as like, if you miss breakfast, you're going to eat a larger lunch type of thing. The third hypothesis I have is that maybe the relationship between temperature and electricity use changed. So now we have a lot of people at home during the day, during the hottest part of the day, and we also had office buildings that needed to be cooled at the same time. So we're losing these economies of scale that we had when we were able to pack a lot of people into these big office buildings potentially, and they could leave their home cooling systems off. The fourth hypothesis I have is that maybe work from home practices or new leisure patterns occurred during the pandemic, and these could have resulted in increased electricity use when people had time to adjust. So it's basically at the beginning part of the pandemic, people were staying at home. They weren't able to really work from home. They moved their laptops and work computers and other office electronics home, and then instead of just being at work, working on your work computer, you're working on your work computer and you're watching Netflix on your television. So you're consuming more electricity potentially. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to explore these hypotheses with a slew of different data. So the first set of data that I bring in to examine these hypotheses is I bring in some cell phone location data. So I want to test whether stay-at-home behavior can explain the electricity consumption patterns. So I get this cell phone location data provided by people are working with this data who are studying the pandemic. You've probably seen some papers with it before. But what I have is I have the median amount of time spent at home at the census block level in the United States. So a census block is basically like a street block, especially in a city. It could contain few houses even. So it's a very granular measure. And so what I do is I match each census block to the PJM zones. And I weight that by the number of devices. And so what I have is the average median time spent at home in each day in each PJM zone. So what does social distancing look like in PJM from 2019 through 2020? So you can see that at the beginning of the pandemic, people did indeed stay at home. And after that first wave subsided, a lot of people ended up basically resuming their normal behavior, which was a little bit difficult for me to believe because I spent most of my time at home. But then I had to remind myself that I'm an academic and I know mostly academics, and that was easy for us. So yeah, this is quite interesting to me. But I also need to know. So we see that people are spending less time at home during the summer, so they're starting to go back out again. But what is the effect of staying at home? Does that actually increase or decrease electricity consumption? So if people are staying at home and they're buying more appliances and watching more Netflix, then maybe that actually increases electricity consumption. So what I do is basically a triple differences analysis of the effect of social distancing on electricity consumption using the same outcome variable as earlier, and regress that on an indicator for being in the pandemic period, as well as a measure of the time spent at home in each zone and an interaction of those two variables. And I control for the number of devices in each zone to control for people doing things like buying additional televisions or et cetera. So what do I find? I find that the effect of social distancing on electricity use is negative. So more time people spend at home, the less electricity is consumed. I allow these coefficients to vary from month to month to see if over time, as people were buying more devices, the relationship changed. But there's not really evidence of that, and the sort of overall average effect is negative. So staying at home reduces electricity consumption. The next thing that I do in the paper is I go to a nationwide panel of monthly utility data. And this I go to so that I can actually look at consumption by different customer classes. So this data is broken up into consumption by residential, industrial, and commercial electricity users, and it's nationwide. And so what I do is I pair this with some weather data from NOAA, and I estimate the effect of being in the pandemic on consumption by customer class. So basically, this is just a regression of electricity consumption reported by each utility on indicators for being in each month of the pandemic, very similar to the other specification. So what do I find? I find that in the first month of the pandemic, electricity consumption in all sectors was down. And then afterwards, residential consumption went up, spiking or sort of peaking in July and August. So residential consumption drove these electricity increases in the summer that seemed sort of inexplicable. And there was a slight recovery in industrial and commercial use in July and August. So what I'm reading from this is that residential consumption is what drove that increase in the summer that we saw. And it was not due to sort of these private sector people making up their contracts or like making up for lost time. All right, so what about the effect of temperature? Did the relationship between temperature and electricity load change in 2020? So I returned to the hourly electricity data from PJM, and I tried to, using hourly temperatures, I try to estimate the relationship between temperature and electricity consumption in 2020 versus in 2014 to 2019. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to skip this ugly equation, and I'm just going to show you the results. So we have, the effect of the average electricity load in each temperature bin controlling for unobserved heterogeneity shows us that 2014 to 2019 electricity consumption and 2020 electricity consumption as it relates to temperature is actually very, very similar. It's impossible to tell by the eye, but a t-test at a couple of these high temperatures does reject a null hypothesis that the two are the same, and a joint t-test or a joint f-test of all of these coefficients does say that the relationship is statistically different. To me, this looks quite similar. So there's some weak evidence that the relationship between temperature and electricity load changed in 2020 relative to previous years, but it's not really that strong. So drawing it all together in the last minute here, what are the findings and what do they mean? So there's evidence that a reduction in social distancing from the heights of April and May did result in increased electricity use. And the increased electricity use is largely driven by the residential sector. There's some weak evidence that at higher temperatures, electricity use was higher in 2020 than in previous years, but this isn't very strong. So it seems that work from home behavior or new leisure behavior is the residual explanation. So that has to be what is sort of driving the differences here. And it has to be stuff that's going on in the home. So what do I take from this? I take from this first that using total electricity consumption as a proxy for macroeconomic health is misleading. I don't think that we had sort of like a macroeconomic boom during the summer. That's not what that meant, because we had a change in the relationship between electricity and macroeconomic sort of like drivers. And then the last thing is that environmental health silver linings may not be as large as expected ex ante, especially from electricity use. Where you need to look is transportation. And a lot of people, I'm sure, are looking at that. So, and that's it. Thank you very much.
There we are. Thank you, Dylan. Are there any questions for Dylan? But Olivier, if you see anything, please let me know. If I can maybe ask you a few things just to start off. First thing is, did you have access to time of day data to see whether the load has in fact shifted during the time that it was the time during the day, especially in the early period?
Yeah, so in the early, I don't do this. There's another person whose paper does this. And during the early period, weekdays did look more like weekends. People were staying up later and sleeping in later. But it doesn't look like drastically like a weekend. I think that that's overstated to some extent. I think that it would be a good idea to estimate the hour load relationship during the summer and during the early period to see how that was different. I do think that's a really nice suggestion.
Okay. The other thing I was thinking about is who pays. So essentially, if people work at home, they all of a sudden become their own subcontractor and they pay for the electricity. Have you thought a little bit about kind of the distributional, income distribution or expense distribution impacts of the work that you're doing now? Because some of what you find seems quite interesting and could have, you could shed some light on potential distributional impacts of the type of behavior that you identify here.
Yeah, I have thought of this a little bit, and it's interesting. So I thought about doing it in this paper and I decided not to, because I think that the entire picture of the distributional impacts has to also include the decline in the amount of time you spend commuting and the amount of money you spend on gasoline or bus fare or whatever, however you commute. So I think that you would need to measure both things. And I suspect, I mean, maybe that's because I value my time very heavily, that people actually probably came out on top, even if they did pay 5 to 10% more in their electricity bill, they probably saved a lot more in time. Yeah. That's my guess. Yeah.
Okay, good. Thanks. So Uli, you have a question?
Now, if I just may add to what you two have been discussing in the last couple of seconds, I think the people who can actually do home office might not be that part of society that is inclined towards energy poverty. So it really depends on the type of jobs that you have. And Dylan, you just said it yourself. I mean, you're an academic. It's easy to at least it is possible to work from home. I never found it easy, but it is possible to work from home. Whereas people who are more at the energy poverty or the distributional aspects level of electricity and energy consumption might find themselves in jobs that are not really possible to work from home. But it would be a very interesting aspect. I totally agree with Andre on that suggestion. Yeah.
Okay, anything else? All right. Well, thank you, Dylan. We'll now go to the second paper by Karol Kempa from the Frankfurt School of Management. And so Marc-Olivier will work his magic, and Karol, you'll be the next to speak.
Yes, thank you very much. So let me try to share my screen. Did that work? Can you all see my slides?
Yes,
Yep.
perfect.
Yep.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you very much. Okay, yeah, so yeah, thank you very much. So my talk will be about greening the COVID-19 economic recovery, and on the lessons from the financial crisis is co-work with my colleague Ashish Tyagi, who was with me postdoc at the Frankfurt School of Finance and Management. So again, the background is where it is a previous presentation, not too much to tell people about COVID. We know that it's a pandemic, and in particular, the global economic downturn caused by the pandemic is the worst since the Great Depression. So as of the end of last year, I think the global economy shrank by 3.5%, and the losses are particularly high in advanced economies with almost 5% GDP loss. And of course, immediately we saw a massive reaction in terms of fiscal spending. So up to now, and this is like data from 50 leading economies, a bit more than 16.5 trillion US dollars have been spent, according to the Oxford University Economic Recovery Project, who collect and classify this data. And in particular, in the short run, of course, Corona itself dominates all political and administrative action. So any environmental, energy, or climate-related issues were not priorities. The main thing was just like to do something against Corona and the immediate effects. So the immediate focus was, of course, immediate health in the health system, and to like have immediate help for the economic crisis. So different schemes to like reimburse workers who high unemployment and so forth, right? So so little of fiscal spending in the beginning, at least, was directed towards green investments or clean energy or pollution abatement or any sort of those things, right? But of course, this changed now during the crisis, when the focus shifted a bit towards the challenge of a long-term recovery, where the focus was not to help the immediately the people or the immediate needs, but actually think how to actually recover from that. And on that, so far, 2.2 trillion have been spent or devoted to, so less than this total immediate help, but still an increasing number. And of course, there's an increasing number of calls from economists, but often in different areas, that it's important to make this recovery a green recovery. So somehow in line with the transition towards a sustainable low carbon economy. And well, as we also just seen in the previous presentation, and also this other paper here, that we saw reductions in energy consumption here, in particular also in emissions, of around 4% in 2020 in total compared to 2019. But this is very likely only temporary, right? So as long as we have this economic downturn, there might be reductions, but it's not a permanent effect. And up to now, around 19% of this recovery spending is expected to enhance sustainability, or so-called green spending. And this is 2.5% of the spending in whole that we saw so far. So the question is now, how important is actually a green spending or a green recovery program for this transition to a sustainable economy? And are there any effects, and how lasting are they? And that's why in this paper, we actually look at the financial crisis, because well, we saw a similar crisis basically. So between 2008 and 2010, well, in economic terms, of course, there was no pandemic, of course, luckily. But yeah, there was also an economic downturn, and also economy spent 3.3 trillion on recovery packages, with around 16% devoted to green measures such as low carbon, renewable energy efficiency, recycling, and different water management in different areas. So in contrast to the COVID-19 case or recovery, also longer term effects can be analyzed, which is, as the nature of things, this cannot be done yet with the current study in the recovery programs. So of course, there have been several studies that actually analyzed those those packages and the economies and how they affected those, but there hasn't been a systematic empirical analysis, at least in the sense that we do it, on the longer term impacts of economic stimulus packages on investments and the environment or in different environmental variables. So what we are trying to do in this paper is that we use a panel data set of OECD countries, and we have basically two questions we want to answer. We first look at green recovery spending as a whole and want to see what are the environmental impacts of that in the period where the stimulus packages was actually spent and afterwards. And in the second part, we want to look how recovery spending dedicated to renewable energy. So zoom in into this green recovery, how this affected renewable energy investments in those economies. And most importantly, we first, of course, collected data on all these recovery packages, and we had like one main data source where we found data for G20 countries. So we had data on recovery spending and the timing, so in which years it was spent, total recovery, how much of it was green stimulus, and this was also further subdivided in specific areas, in particular also, for example, low carbon energy, which we use later on. And then we extended this data set by looking at a lot of different studies and papers, also government reports and documents, to get data for more countries and also a bit to cross-check the main data that we had. And we, at this point, let's say this is quite a work in progress, have a sample of 27 OECD countries that we can analyze here. And here, maybe just a glimpse on the data on green stimulus spending on the here on the COVID-19 crisis. So this is not the data that we use, but just to give you a glimpse what is currently going on. So on the horizontal axis, you see the recovery spending as a percentage of GDP, and on the vertical, the green recovery share of that. And in the different, well, quarters of this area, like mapping of different countries. So in the top right corner, you have the current leaders, as they call it here, so countries with a lot of recovery spending, but also a high share of green, and so forth. So this is the situation what looks like now in euro crisis. And to compare it, this is the data that we use from the financial crisis, plotted here in a very similar manner. So maybe one thing that you see immediately is that there were less countries in this maybe favorable top right corner with a high stimulus package and a lot of green share, but well, in general, the picture is quite similar. You have countries in all different areas of this. Just give you a glimpse on that. So, so this is our data on the stimulus packages that we use, and then we need data on for all our other variables that we need. So for renewable energy investment, we use data from Bloomberg Near Energy Finance. So here we have actually project level data on investments in utility scale renewable plants that we aggregate to annual national investments in renewables as a whole and all by different technologies. And if you don't know this data, what is specific about this is that it's recorded at the financial close of a project. So it's a bit closer to the actual investment decision than other renewable energy deployment data, maybe change in capacity. So you have like closer to the actual decision being taken. The disadvantage is that it's maybe not reliable, because of course it could be that you have a deal that was at financial close, a project that was decided on, but might later actually not be built. Bloomberg corrects for this, but I mean, still there might be these issues in the data. So on environmental impacts, nothing too spectacular. So we use data on CO2 emissions per capita from the World Bank, and data on the ecological footprint of production per capita from the Global Footprint Network. And then we collect data from our control variables, mainly from the World Bank, for our regressions that we run. And here just a few descriptive statistics of our data set. So you see, I mean, in particular for the CO2 emissions and the ecological footprints, the observations are a smaller number of observations, because with those we only have data until 2016, but renewable energy investments, we have data until 2019. Okay, so let's get into the empirical approach for our first small analysis. So when we look at now first the environmental impacts, we see in our data set that almost all countries in the sample have actually at least some green recovery spending, with I think 1 or 2 exceptions. And so what we do is we analyze the impact of the share of green stimulus on our measures of environmental performance, on CO2 per capita and the ecological footprint of production. So with our first model analysis, we want to ask the question, how are there any lasting environmental impacts of green recovery spending? So on the left hand of our equation, we have CO2 emissions or the ecological footprint. And we then look at have dummies for the stimulus period, which differs by country. Some have only 1 year, some 2, 3, or even 4 years where they have stimulus packages. Then the post-stimulus period, and then both dummies interacted with our variable that gives us the green share of the stimulus and control variables and time and country fixed effects. And here are the results that we get. So if we just look at CO2 emissions, in the first column is that, not surprisingly, GDP and energy use has a positive impact on emissions per capita. What we can see as well is that in the stimulus period and the post-stimulus period, even without independent of the green stimulus share, there seems to be on average a decline in CO2 emissions. But there's an additional effect in the stimulus, but in particular in the post-stimulus period of the green stimulus share. So the more a country has spent on green stimulus relative to total spending, there is a negative effect of CO2 emissions during the spending period, but also on average in the period afterwards until 2016. So, and we see a similar thing for the ecological footprint. We don't see any effects for the hypothetical case where the green stimulus is 0, but we also see a negative effect on of the green stimulus share on this variable. So the higher the green stimulus share, the lower is the ecological footprint during the stimulus period and also afterwards. So these are our first results that we have on the environmental impacts. And to get briefly to our second analysis that we do within this paper is we look at renewable energy investment. So again, when you look at this green stimulus data, and just as a reminder, I think almost all countries had at least a small share of green stimulus. It contains information of how much of the stimulus spending was actually allocated to renewable energy. And the nice thing here is that we have not all of the countries with green stimulus, green recovery packages had parts of the package actually devoted to renewable energy. So I think it's slightly less than half of the countries in our sample had actually spending on low carbon power, so on renewable energy, utility scale, and other countries did not have this, and those we use as a control group in our first try here. So we just basically create a dummy variable. And here again, the equation looks very similar. So on the left-hand side, we have renewable energy investments per capita in a country. Then we again differentiate the stimulus period and the post-stimulus period and interact those variables with our RE dummy, which is 1 equal to countries with a stimulus spending explicitly devoted to renewable energies and 0 otherwise. And again, our set of controls and country and year fixed effects. And what we basically find here is that if you look at the first column, this is all renewable energy investments together, which is wind, solar, biomass, and maybe for completeness to say also marine energy and small hydro. But there are so few investments, in particular in these advanced economies, that I didn't analyze them individually. You see, at least in the post-stimulus period, a positive effect. So in those countries that actually had renewable energy stimulus packages, we see in the longer run, on average, higher renewable energy investments compared to countries without such stimulus packages devoted to renewable energies. If you actually then look at technologies individually, you still find an effect weakly significant for wind, but no effects for solar and biomass. One reason might be that wind actually, we have the highest and the most consistent investments. For solar, there's at least countries where, at least in the end of the samples, they actually decline because at least utility scale investments in some of the countries go down, while actually in the area of PV, like home scale applications or residential PV is more important, which is not covered here. And one odd effect is that we can't explain yet is that we see during the stimulus period actually a negative effect of this renewable energy stimulus packages on those investments. So here we at least don't have an explanation yet, might dig a bit deeper into the data that we have. So what are our preliminary conclusions? Again, as I said, it's ongoing work. So overall, we see that CO2 emissions per capita decreased on average after the financial crisis, at least controlled for all these characteristics we had in our equation. This seems not to be the case for the ecological footprint. But in both cases, we actually see impacts of green stimulus. So we see that the higher the green stimulus spending is, this actually yields additional CO2 emission reductions and on average lower ecological footprint of production in the post-stimulus periods. Then what we also see is that renewable energy investments actually recovered relatively quickly after the financial crisis. So this is what I didn't show you here, but if you look at the data, there you see a small bump down, but already 2010, 2011 investments jump up quite quickly. But also we see like that dedicated stimulus packages, or at least in the countries that had those, we saw on average higher investments after the crisis. So what we would conclude is that overall our findings, our preliminary findings that we have seem to indicate that the type of stimulus actually plays a role and seems to have some kind of a persistent impact at least, which in our opinion stresses the importance that is already brought forward, of course, of greening the post-COVID economic recovery as well, if to like be in line with the transition towards a sustainable low carbon economy. So that's it from my side, and thank you very much, and looking forward to any comments and suggestions for our work. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Karol. Any questions? Dylan?
Yeah, thanks, Karol. I think that if you view this in the light of crowding out versus sort of directed technological change or directed investment, that you kind of get an interesting story that maybe contemporaneously this green spending crowds out sort of private spending. And then in the after period, when people have to sort of like take up the slack themselves, that they don't just like leave these projects, they actually direct capital towards them, which I think, I don't know if that's true. It's just the numbers are suggestive of that. And it's pretty interesting to me.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Uli?
From the German perspective, I remember discussing with the German government back then that renewable energy projects are somehow too small to fall into the categories of the like typical financing instruments. We have been discussing mezzanine finance and other things. So that might be explaining a little bit the difference between wind and solar. And then investment in solar doesn't necessarily mean, in particular in the time where you're looking at, doesn't necessarily mean less megawatt installed. Because I mean, you are looking at the time period where the price was just deteriorating by, I don't know how many percent, almost by the second. So if you just for fun run it against megawatt and not investment, you might get a really different result.
Yeah, no, it's actually, thank you very much for the latter comment. It's actually a very good idea because we have this in the data, so we could basically aggregate it as well and look at megawatts, but still have like this idea of investment that it's recorded at the time where the investment decision is taking place, but actually look at the megawatts. That's a very good point. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
I had it in front of me and didn't think of it.
So if I may, one thing, I always frequently have trouble interpreting interaction variables and coefficients on interaction variables. And it's unfair for me to say you should have done more here. But in the paper, I think it would be really nice to unpack what is it, in fact, that that you're trying to measure with these interaction terms, and what, in fact, are you finding? And what are the marginal impacts on the variables that you're interested in? I think that would be really, for me anyways, would make this paper a lot easier for me to read, I anticipate. The other thing is that when you break down your into categories of green spending, I didn't see anything about energy efficiency.
Yeah.
You have wind, you have solar, you've got, so you're really focused on production.
Yeah.
Right. So when you talk about, because you did say that it's about renewable energy, but what about energy efficiency? Were there programs of spending during that time on on increasing energy efficiency?
I mean, there were, and at least in the data that I have, there is also spending on that as well. So there's a
Okay.
differentiation between renewable energies, energy efficiency, and then like water management, waste pollution, and so forth. So it is there, but I only had, at least at this time being, data on renewable energy investments. It is, at least as far as I know, more difficult, or I haven't found nice energy efficiency investment data to analyze that as well. So with the spending data, it would be possible. I would just need basically a nice variable for the left-hand side to actually look at the investments. Yeah, but it is in there. So there is information on spending explicitly dedicated on energy efficiency as well.
Okay. Anything else, Uli? You had your...
Yeah, I was a bit reluctant because I know on the country level for Germany, there's a lot of data on spending on energy efficiency, but I don't think country level data.
Okay.
Okay. Marc-Olivier, are there any other questions? People I can't see?
I don't see any question too, so I guess not.
Okay. Anything else from anybody here? No? Okay. Well, thank you very much, Karol.
Thank you.
Next paper is by Ulrike Lehr, who's with the International Renewable Energy Agency. So Uli, please take it away.
Yeah, thank you. Let me just bring this up to the start and go to presentation mode. And there we are, right? Are we? Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, thanks for having me. And whoever put this session together, thanks for putting Karol in front of me. So we actually, we are going more and more macro in this session, starting from the micro story that Dylan shared. Now, Karol still with individual equations. And now I come with, first of all, of course, being with IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency, a bit more message oriented. And also with results from a large econometric model. So for those of you who do not know who the International Renewable Energy Agency is, this is the small advertising break. We have been put together and established in 2011. We have our headquarters and secretariat in Masdar City, Abu Dhabi, UAE, where I am also usually based. That's the United Arab Emirates. We have an innovation and technology center in Bonn, Germany, and we are permanent observers to the United Nations. That brings a small office to New York in the USA. The mandate, it is a member-based organization agency. The mandate is to promote the widespread adoption and sustainable use of all forms of renewable energy worldwide. And what we do to help that along is we are producing academic-based, science-based studies, which the members then can take to do informed policy decisions. Since UAE is a bit out of the world, this is a picture of our headquarters and how we are living up to our mandate. So this is the building in the middle of the desert, but we are still using 50% less water than typical buildings. We are covering our 75% hot water demand by solar water heaters. We are trying to recover, talking about efficiency, we are trying to recover 75% of the energy released by the air conditioning system. And trust me, I have been leaving there because the temperatures hit the lower 50s, and that is Celsius. So you do need air conditioning. 75% of the energy generated from lowering elevators, that's kind of a key point to take home, is harnessed and reused. I would like to say that the presentation draws heavily from two IRENA reports, the post-COVID recovery and the global renewable energy outlook. Now, the outlook we are doing annually. So that's kind of a sister or stepbrother or publication of what the IAEA does. This has, of course, a larger focus on renewable energy, and you may want to check that out. The new one will be published end of June. And there we are looking at our version of the net zero scenario by 2050. This is still drawing on the old publication from last year. This gives you an overview of the necessary CO2 emission reductions under different scenarios. So the planned energy scenario comprises all pledges for the NDCs. We go beyond that in this line. We go to what was called the transforming energy scenario. That's a much higher reduction of emissions, and currently will we be going to the net zero scenario with even higher CO2 emission reductions. You see that renewable energy, I mean, this is being ARENA, right? You see that renewable energy figures largely in all these scenarios, and followed by energy efficiency. And then the more ambitious the scenarios get, I don't know where you have the pictures, but this, in my view, it's now covered by the pictures, but to the right, then blue hydrogen comes to play, but also the carbon removal technologies in the more ambitious scenarios come to play. We found, however, that basically informing our constituency and our membership, but also in general, the energy transition has to go beyond the megawatts and has to also look at the economic effects in terms of employment, in terms of challenges, in terms of job losses and gains. And so we are basically employing this framework, having at the core the energy economy environment model, and then coming up with these indicators, GDP, employment, and welfare. And if any of these interests you beyond what will be sharing on the next slides, just please ask me in the question session. Okay, this is the combination and the modeling framework. I always find this a bit hard to look at. So there is a scenario framework coming from our colleagues in Bonn. And then there is Cambridge Econometrics E3ME model at the core that is taking care of the economic modeling framework, and more in terms of words. I don't know if you are familiar or ever heard of the E3ME model. It's a macroeconometric modeling framework. I did not bring any equations because this is a large macroeconometric model with into the 10,000s of equations. It is based on time series of historical data. They explain the behavior. Basically, it's a bit post-Keynesian in approach. So the whole framework is driven by the estimations and then the projections based on past data, the projections of the past behavior into the future. However, most of these equations can then also be adjusted and basically overwritten by different assumptions. So if you feel that people's behavior in the past has been not so much influenced by, for instance, looking at the energy price, but you assume there will be a different change in behavior, so you can actually override that, but and the rest of the model is still adjusting. It has an input-output core, 43 sector input-output tables for most regions that are mapped there, which are single countries. So then you think, okay, there's Cambridge Econometrics doing the modeling, and there is our scenarios from Bonn. So what is this lady from Abu Dhabi doing? And why is she telling us, why is she giving us the presentation? Well, our input is focusing a lot on the respective policies. So to actually try to come up with a policy basket that that makes this whole thing works. We are providing economic and technical information on the input coefficient. So the whole set of, for those of you who have seen an input-output table, the whole set of input coefficients regarding renewable energy, energy efficiency, anything in transport, enhancing the grid, that is exactly where we come in. And then the welfare index has a lot of dimensions, socioeconomic dimension, social dimension, energy access dimension, etc. So that is also something that has been thought out with us in my unit, and forthcoming in the next round of issue will be trade aspects, so where we can shed some light on who's actually manufacturing the renewable energy technologies and the energy efficiency technologies that we are using, and where are they produced, and that again of course relates to jobs opportunities. So that's a bit the advertising slide for the model, data-driven. It is a non-equilibrium, no enforced equilibrium. That's a rather important point and a key feature of this type of model. So this is deliberately not a CGE. It allows for inefficiency, for lock-in technologies, and for rigidities. Let me come to results, and I'm really happy because this is basically a slide that Karol took care of, because he already mentioned there's a lot of demand and challenges, and a lot of international organizations and institutions have said that we need to build back better, we need to build forward better, we pretty much need to green in any direction possibly. So there is a lot of claim for that. And IRENA was among the first things to also issue claims like that. And we see it that the cumulative clean energy investment between today basically and 2023 would be close to $6 trillion. And Karol, you had like a 1 point something trillion already spent and already pledged. So that's kind of an interesting perspective, actually, where we, need to go if this would put us on a pathway to 1.5 degree or to net zero. And this is a possible and likely spending in the first couple of years. Now, if the world adheres to that and agrees to that, then what would that do to our economies? It could give rise to 5.5 million additional jobs in energy efficiency, in renewable energy. And of course, with this transition, you also lose jobs in fossil fuel industry. And I come on one of the next slides, I come to a regional breakdown. And I think this is where the interesting factors come in. But that would lead to a 1% more GDP, not compared to today, but between the different scenarios with less investment right now and this additional investment right now. Now here you see the breakdown of the jobs on a longer perspective. So if we then follow this path and have a bit of a front-loaded in the next decade investment that partly addresses the challenges from the economic challenges, that is from COVID, also partly addresses the health challenges from COVID in developing countries, because we've seen a large connection between not having access to neither clean nor energy as such, and having and health, of course. So also addressing that challenge would then lead to an additional 19 million energy transition related jobs. But then the transition progresses further, and of course the job losses in certain areas progress further. You see like the fossil fuel job losses, and of course, for instance, China under this scenario will then see several losses in the fossil fuel industries. However, this area would also see a lot of gains in jobs, in energy efficiency, but most important also from renewable energy. This is the new publication, the 1.5 degree pathway, that even shifts the investment more towards the front. Unfortunately, it's not published, so I couldn't really bring any of the numbers. This is to make you curious and watch out for it, because it has an even more front-loaded scenario and suggests in rather good detail how international cooperation could help, how international cooperation can be strengthened to also address the distributional effects, the international, the between, like, you know, north-south and so on, distributional effects. So that would be maybe an interesting report to look into from that perspective. From our results until 2050, we find that globally we do have a much higher performance. So the difference in employment now is even higher. So it goes beyond the 20 million. And this difference in employment is always only sort of in the energy sector. So there's of course second order effects in the overall economy that makes even for a higher difference in employment. But again, you see East Asia then is losing a lot of fossil fuel jobs, rest of Asia too, the Middle East, of course, and Northern Africa will lose a lot of fossil fuel jobs. Come to countries like, for instance, Algeria come to mind, or also the area I'm living at right now. But if you look at the renewable energy value chains, then of course there's more to it than just what you, yes, thank you. There's more to it than what you see in, for instance, the Bloomberg data, because you get employment along the value chain, basically. So you get employment from transport, from installation, from operation and maintenance, and in some cases already from decommissioning. And of course, our data on decommissioning are fairly weak currently, because there's not so much of decommissioning going on, but in the future, I think that needs to be addressed much more deeply. This draws on another series of reports we are doing, actually. It's called Leveraging, and it really sheds some light on the detailed aspects of employment along the value chain. So it takes the input-output table and moves employment along, and actually comes up with a detailed breakdown of employment in the different phases of the value chain. And then I come to the last slide already, and that is a very, very brief overview of the key policy measures that we are all addressing in much more detail in a lot of reports. And so obviously we are supporting also the member states in terms of development of their NDC and development of their energy transition related plans. We are currently trying to address also through the instrument of NDCs, renewable energy in climate change adaptation. Then we are having a lot of individual reports on mobilizing investment, on investment. We are each year looking at employment that already took place in the renewable energy sector. That's a bottom-up research, pretty much a data collecting exercise, and gaps are filled with input-output based estimates. And we are currently and in the future looking much more at energy access and energy poverty, and suggesting also policies to address that, and trying to find the link between renewable energy, energy access, and energy poverty. And in particular with access and poverty, I think there is a large field. You can have energy poverty in like all, you know, all developed and all developing countries. So access alone doesn't really help for productive use for energy, but you also have to be then, you know, able to afford it. And there's I think a wild field for academic research, but also for policy advice. And with this, I would like to stop right here, and I can go deeper into any of these aspects, and I'm happy to also respond to any kind of you trying to get in touch, but I stop right here. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Uli. We've had a change in the middle of all of this. Felix has taken over from Marc-Olivier, so I'll ask Felix to let me know if there's any questions. But are there any questions that anybody would like to ask?
That's okay, I'm back.
Marc-Olivier is back. Good. Okay. So maybe I can ask Uli a few things, if I may. I was surprised at how small your investments in the power grid are.
Okay.
The power grid, right? I mean, you're in your, because typically the story that we're told is there's going to be a lot more electrification in the future. Therefore, you need to build more, you know, you need capacity to add capacity to the power grid. And then I'll have a follow-up after that, but maybe you can react to that here.
Yeah, I mean, this is, I mean, yeah, okay. And let's go to the first here, this one. Okay, so this is basically reaping in the low-hanging fruit investment-wise, because that's the response to COVID. So basically you are doing here what you can do immediately. And the power grid is not among the things that you would be doing immediately. Energy efficiency, in particular in building, actually, although it's not really done, but it would be investment-wise and by the effects it has on jobs and on triggering the economy and being domestic. Energy efficiency is your let's say sector where you can really have a large effect very quickly. That's why that features so largely on energy efficiency, and that's why electrification and infrastructure is comparatively small. I agree. Yeah.
Okay. Because I think part of the issue for me is, you know, if I take Canada for example, you know, we're now into 2021. It's not possible to build a transmission line of any kind before now and 2030. Just won't happen.
Exactly.
Right? You have the approval processes and all of that stuff. It simply will not happen. So one of the challenges that I have with a lot of the forecasts or the projections I've seen is that the time frame is just so short.
Yeah.
It assumes that all of this can happen quickly, and I'm uncomfortable with that.
That's why this is rather small. I mean, there's smaller countries than Canada. And there's, of course, also, I mean, you know, like size-wise, I mean, like area-wise. So I think electrification and infrastructure in a lot of European countries is much easier and much easier also to put into practice. And this also, of course, includes stuff like smart metering and so on. So in any global in large cities and so on, that is also the investment that goes there. But I totally agree on the administrative side of things. It is really difficult, and that is one of our largest barrier, basically, because and it has been, and this is really where policy comes into play, right? I mean, if you take Germany, which I just know very well, the administrative side of things has almost killed renewable energy investment there, right? And there were different times where this was more was made by policy was made more easy, and the numbers were much better. So this is, I mean, red tape is definitely a governance issue.
Right. Anything else, Marc-Olivier? Okay.
I can ask a question.
Okay, Dylan, please.
Yeah, Uli, what assumptions are built in about how people are going to go back to work? Are people in your model going back to work in traditional buildings, or are they staying working from home, or is that, have you thought about that a lot at all?
Well, we haven't thought about that a lot and at all in large detail. So there is an assumption that some of the home office, it's very rough. Actually, it is very rough. A share of, so what is assumed is a small shift towards more home office and less commuting. Basically, what they are looking at is they're taking out the commuting. I'm not really sure if it was like above an hour. Whoever commuted more than an hour is now moving to home office, and there is a rough estimate of which jobs that can possibly be. So, I mean, this is just done by a share, basically. So, and it's not like included in the model, so it's not explicitly modeled, but it's literature-based desk search coming up with these shares and then putting it into the macro model. But I thought it made sense in a way, you know, as a first rough estimate. And since we didn't really have time to look deeply into it, I think the first people who will try to stay home are those who are stuck in the traffic jam forever. Yeah.
Good. Okay. Well, thank you very much. Thanks, Uli. The next paper, the presenter is Katerina Ferroukhi. And Katerina is with the Energy Policy Unit at the National Technical University of Athens. So, Katerina.
Hello, everybody. Yes, let me share my screen. Can you see it, right? Hello, I'm Katerina Ferroukhi, a researcher from National Technical University of Athens, and I will present to you joint work done with researchers from Basque Center for Climate Change and the Imperial College. In this study, we sought to identify the optimal allocation of renewable energy subsidies from COVID recovery packages in European Union, with the objectives to further mitigate emissions and create new jobs in the energy green transition. On top of current policy scenarios that was simulated within the framework of Paris Reinforced Project, we used budgets aligned with announced plans and coupled an integrated assessment model with technological portfolio analysis. So let's begin with the contents of this presentation. We will first present the context of the case study, which relies on budget estimates retrieved from the EU recovery plans. And then we will see the tools and methods used for the study and an overview of our results, and the discussion on these findings will follow. We will also explore some next steps. As already said, the scope of this study has been to see how to best allocate part of the announced recovery plans in renewable energy technologies on top of Paris Reinforced current policy scenario, with the aim to further push emissions down, while at the same time maximizing employment gains in the energy sector. Based on Eurostat, about 1.8 million jobs have been lost during the the pandemic in EU from September 2019 until September 2002. So we figured this should be a key priority in putting together a solid and green COVID recovery. We trailed the proposed breakdown of the COVID recovery plan, as you can see here, looking at what part of the recovery and the resilience facility could admittedly theoretically be used for energy technology subsidies, and ended up with subsidies of with budgets between 1 and 200 billion euros for the next 5 years. So we use this budget as a budget constraint for our model. For this purpose, at first, an extensive literature review is performed in order to identify the impact of sustainable technologies in terms of employment, and then one integrated assessment model, one YAM called GCAM, is employed to assess different levels of subsidization on these technologies. The results are fed into a portfolio analysis model based on OCMECONAR and a Monte Carlo simulation to handle uncertainty in order to identify optimal strategy for the envisaged budget that maximize the creation of new jobs and the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. So we checked that this integrated assessment model GCAM and the outputs for different levels of subsidies in 8 key technologies, including biofuels, biomass, concentrated solar power, geothermal, solar photovoltaics, electric vehicles, and wind and biogas, and touching upon generation, transport, and buildings and other sectors. The jobs and energy produced for the majority of technologies were derived from the EU Observatory, which allowed us to calculate the jobs per unit of energy metrics used in the GCAM model. And for some technologies, for example, for CSP, we used data from Spain, which since most European CSP projects are located in Spain. And then for geothermal energy, we used Italian data. Because most of the geothermal production in EU is located in Italy. And we used also that data from 2 other papers, Fragos and Parousos and Rutovic et al., in order to calculate the jobs. And this chart shows some simulation results from the models that are participating in the Paris Reinforce project. From this data, we used the line which represents data from the GCAM model. So these two, the jobs and the emissions, were the initial inputs that were fed into the GCAM model, and the outputs of the GCAM model were then used as input for our portfolio analysis model. Let me directly dive into the results of the portfolio analysis. A quick read says negligible emission cuts, but there are multiple interesting takes and twists, and I will get to that. In a sense, depending on the budget, we see here the 3 budget levels. The results change markedly in terms of portfolio mixes, but not so much in terms of qualitative synthesis. For all 3 assumed budgets, and again, I must stress that all this should be revisited when the final member state requests for financing are submitted and published. We see that biofuels, wind and biogas and geothermal subsidies dominate all portfolios. In some less diversified cases, only 3 of these technologies make it. So depending on the focus along the optimality or trade-off front, we will see that in more detail in the next slides. About 250,000 jobs can be generated in the broad energy sector, leading to a long run of 50 to 120 megatons of CO2 equivalent, when the smallest considered investment capacity is assumed, namely the 100 billion, and up to 60 from 60 up to 90 percent more than this in terms of new employment, as well as a middle to fourfold increase in terms of emission cuts for double the price, namely for 200 billion, as we can see in this table. Here we see in more detail the results for the portfolios when the available budget is limited to 100 billion. We find a set of portfolios that are optimal in solving our multi-objective problem. These are located in this curve that you can see with the blue color, which is called the Pareto optimal curve. And here we have identified and further presented in detail how two indicative optimal portfolios are structured in terms of technologies participation. So this curve is full of points that are containing technologies with different mix. So from portfolio 1 to portfolio 2, there is a shift from biofuel to wind investments, which increases jobs but limits emission reduction, because as we can see, portfolio 1 is the one with the best performance in emissions reduction, and portfolio 2 is one of the best in terms of increasing jobs. We also did an uncertainty analysis in a plus or minus 5% range for both parameters per subsidy package. So in all subsidies, we saw similar active trade-offs, mainly between biofuels and wind. Biofuels maximize the emission reduction potential throughout, and on the other end of the optimality front, we can see that wind not only drastically improves the employment benefits, but it also makes up the most robust portfolios against uncertainty. Here we can see it with more intense color and bigger bubbles. This does not apply jobs in the technologies, making it into the optimal subsidy portfolios, but across the energy sector, as reflected in the modeling dynamics. For example, subsidies in renewables may lead to extra direct and indirect jobs in natural gas or other fossils due to the backup capacity requirements. This also hints that given achieved policy targets of renewable share, some renewables essentially compete against other renewables in the energy mix. Here are similar results for 150 billion budget constraint. We also see the optimal Pareto front, and we have highlighted 3 portfolios. For example, here in portfolio 3, you can see some indicative portfolio that has the best performance in jobs. And for example, portfolio 3 is in fact one that close to maximize jobs, meaning that emission cuts are in the lower optimal bound. And when replacing biofuels in investments with other technologies, for example, with wind, this increases jobs and limits emission reduction. Similar here we see active trade-offs between biofuels and winds. And while we move towards larger investment capacity, we can see biogas breaks into the mix to essentially balance the portfolios. Again, here is the portfolio for 200 billion. And interestingly, here the 200 billion euro portfolio single out here it actually maximizes the emission cuts, but still manages to create almost 430,000 jobs, meaning that the curve there straight out gives an easy peak, which however is far from the most uncertainty robust, as we can see here in the robustness curve. So the core finding of the study is that 100 to 200 billion euro subsidies could achieve further up to 1% of greenhouse gas emission cuts. This may sound small, but at the same time it creates 2,000 to 400,000 jobs in the energy sector, supporting the COVID-impacted employment as a side effect of the green transition. And we should note that 2030 is really the first year in the model that the emissions impacts of subsidies are reflected. So in a single year or post 2030 comparison would probably hint larger benefits into that. The main caveat is that this is still based on one of the many models of Paris reinforced project. So this is very much work in progress. But the first read of the modeling dynamics showed that we can in fact gain financially on these investments in terms of pushing down cost of existing policies. From a technological point of view, we can see that biofuels, wind and biogas appear overall optimal when considering both criteria, and that uncertainty plays out quite differently in terms of robust portfolio synthesis. Moving on to some other interesting dynamics of the study, clearly emphasizing emissions reduction by prioritizing, for example, subsidies in biofuels could possibly lead to some land use change emissions outside the EU, which could also be why for the same subsidies, we see opposite leaning impacts globally. We can also see that geothermal is not that competitive compared to the other three technologies, and yet make it into all solutions due to its low cost and positive impacts along both axes. What was also very interesting was that solar power appears to reach its tipping point in the base scenario, in the sense that there is already high penetration of photovoltaics in the electricity mix under the current policy scenarios we first examined, meaning that additional subsidies seem to increase the resulting emissions, pointing again to the need for gas to balance the grid load. And that expectedly electric vehicles do lead to further emission cuts, but these are expensive and their deployment impact is virtually negligible. As next steps for this study, we should include a multi-model analysis and include more EAMs, results from more EAMs, as here we include only results from the GCAM model. And we could also add more objectives in our multi-objective model, because the model is built to include as many objectives as desirable. And for example, this could be industrial value added or health. And we could also integrate more detail in employment factors. Maybe we could use more realistic databases in order to estimate these factors. This is all for the study. I will be glad to hear your questions.
Okay. Thank you very much. Any questions for Katerina? Maybe I
please.
can ask, what is it about biofuels and biogas? What's about the technology that makes them emerge as low-cost emissions reductions opportunities in the sample that you looked at?
Okay, so what do you mean? Why they are cheap?
Well, at the end, you know, your optimal package seems to be very much oriented towards biofuels and biogas. And for me, that's an unusual result. These typically, in my part of the world anyways, would be on the higher end of the cost scale in terms of emissions reduction. So what do you think is different, or, you know, I didn't want to put it that way because that presupposes you understand where I'm coming from. I'm just trying to say, on an absolute terms, why are these things relatively cheap emissions reduction?
We should note here that this analysis is on the top of some current policy scenarios. So on the top of the results that are derived from current policies analysis, we reinvest the budget from the recovery plans. So I think this happens because of the performance of these technologies in terms of emission cuts, because
Do you have
of
negative
the
emissions?
potential to reduce emissions.
Okay. Do you have negative emissions? Is it that you're basically using CCS or something to put the CO2 in from the biogas production biofuel in the ground? Is that partly what's going on?
Yes, I suppose.
Okay. All right. Good. Any
Then
other
it would
questions?
be,
Uli?
yeah, this is on jobs. I mean, I think, Andre, you might know that I've been busy with modeling renewable energy and jobs for the last 15 years. So I would like to before I went to Irina, I would like to better understand, Katerini, what exactly are you doing there with to get your jobs results? Because in your paper, you should be really, really clear. And maybe you should revisit a bit of the literature on renewable energy and jobs, because there's just so much out there. And you should be very clear if you mean what the community dealing with renewable energy and jobs is calling direct jobs. So those that are directly employment per megawatt. Are you including also indirect jobs along the value chain? Are you just looking at the operation and maintenance? Are you also looking at the planning and installation phase? So what exactly is the relation between the money spent and the jobs that you get? I mean, let me say, I mean, for that amount of money spent, a lot of studies get a lot more jobs. So your numbers seem to be fairly small for that large amount of additional spending. And then for 2025, I don't know if that is a momentary result, if that is just the result in 2025, and where are all these people working? Are they, you know, working in operation and maintenance, as I said, or what exactly are these 200,000 people doing?
Yes, this is something I mean, now we use data from the EU Observatory, but because, let's say, our source for all technologies is not the same, we now want to run these models with some job estimation found in another database. So this, I don't think if it is public yet. So then we will rerun these models.
Okay, and then in this database, would that be employment per megawatt in the installation phase, or would it be in operating and maintaining? Or I mean, you might remember my presentation. There's this whole value chain with different phases, and the labor intensity along the value chain is very, very different. So
Yes,
do you know,
of course.
maybe just, maybe just when you are redoing it, and one of your points that you want to further look into is the jobs estimate, maybe you just want to take that into consideration also.
Dylan?
Yeah, I have a different gripe about the jobs. And coming from sort of an economic perspective, it seems strange to me that the number of jobs would actually be an objective. It seems to me that what you would want is you would want to get the most energy efficiency for the least number of jobs so that more people could spend their time doing other productive things. I know that this is coming from an academic economist, and these are reports that are for policymakers, and policymakers are trying to maximize the number of jobs. But that's just sort of a general gripe, not just for Katerina, but also for Uli. But yeah, that it was sort of stewing with me during both presentations, and yeah, I finally realized what it was.
Jobs are
Yeah, I'm happy you say that. I mean, of course, that is something we are always hearing from an efficient, like a productivity and economic efficiency and almost CGE point of view. Of course, the less labor you have to spend on something, getting the same result, the more efficient it would be, and it's actually good news. Now, this type of research and this type of message is, of course, always against the background of a lot of, and maybe this is outdated meanwhile, I don't know, maybe you are next generation. I mean, this is against the background of worlds where the story was always, oh, greening and renewable energy and all that is killing the economy and costing jobs.
No, I think that my perspective is just American microeconomist. So
absolutely, and I totally,
I won't claim to represent the next generation.
You're North
me
American.
from Virginia Tech. I mean, I'm very, very familiar with it.
Good. Any other questions? Thank you. Marc-Olivier, anything else?
No, I don't see anything. So
okay.
For me,
so
that's okay.
We have a little bit of time left, so I'm going to ask you something. It's completely unfair, but I will ask it anyway. So, of each of the presenters, you've kind of, if you put yourself back when you started this work, what is the one thing that you learned that still strikes out with you? What's the main thing that you learned doing this? So it may not be an outcome of the result of the paper. It may be something that you learned along the way. But if you think, this is what I learned, the main thing I learned from this work, what would it be? So I know it's unfair, but I'll start with Dylan, given that it's you were the first one. So I'll dump this on you first.
Well, I guess that I have an easy time answering this question because the whole paper started, I was going to look at how energy suppliers changed their bidding behavior in response to COVID-19, given that there was a lot of uncertainty over sort of like projections of electricity consumption in the day-ahead market. And I quickly pivoted to just looking at the effect of COVID-19 on electricity consumption because I was shocked to find higher electricity consumption during the summer. That is not what I expected at all. And yeah, I was very surprised by that. And I was also surprised not to find stronger evidence that temperature was driving this because I thought for sure that when people were at home and office buildings were being cooled, that was going to be the biggest story to take away. But it seems to just be more seems not to be that.
It's also not a happy story for automatic thermostats and all of those kind of things, self-adjusting thermostats. That's another point. But thank you. Thanks for that. Karol, what's your main learning from this? What did you learn?
Well, let's say maybe two learnings. One actually related to the research that we've done. So what was most striking to me was actually that to see some like long lasting effects of those recovery packages. So we're just expecting that you see something in the short run, but nothing in the long run. And this seems to be almost even the opposite way. So that was a very good learning, and we put some more work into to actually may try to rule out that this is not an artificial finding and we've forgotten something important, but it seems to be a nice learning so far. And the second learning maybe about the process is actually that it's a surprisingly difficult and the pain in the to actually find out the recovery spending data. So I mean, it took so much time. Like I mean, they're good data sources, but I mean, how much time we spend to like go through government reports, parliamentary decisions to actually find out data or information on spending of countries was actually quite a lot of work. So this was quite a learning. Something that you would think that it's actually easy to find data on.
Oh, good. Thank you. Uli.
Yeah, for me, it's particularly mean because I'm mostly basing what I presented on other people's work. So what I learned is it is easy to base a nice presentation on other people's work because I just started. I just started in this position. But let's be a bit more serious. What I did learn from the modeling results is how, at least, and I think that is also matching reality, how resilient the global economy is towards shocks. It is really surprising. So even the COVID and also what Karol told us, like the 2009, I mean, in the long run, we are not only all dead, but in the long run, there is a surprising resilience towards shocks. And being in the renewable energy climate change business, basically, we should not draw the wrong conclusions from this.
Great. Good point. Good point. Good. Thank you. Ekaterini, anything you'd like to share? What did you learn? What's the main thing you learned doing this work?
Actually, I was mainly involved in the portfolio analysis exercise. So these dynamics and trade-offs between the technologies in terms of portfolios was the thing.
Okay, good. Now I'm going to ask you another question. If you were to stand 3 or 5 years into the future, what do you think is your result that will stand the test of time best? If there's one thing coming out of the paper that you think 3 or 5 years from now, I'm still going to be talking about this, or it's still going to be a relevant finding, what would that be? Do the same order. Dylan, what do you think?
Well, I mean, I suppose that I hope that I'm not talking about it bitterly. I hope that this paper grabs some attention of people. I know that a lot of people are writing papers looking at the health effects of COVID-19, like the environmental health effects. So I hope that in 3 to 5 years, people have sort of looked at the entirety of 2020, including sort of the bounce back and not just the first 3 months. I think a lot of people are looking at just the first 3 months because they want to find an interesting, large positive effect on the environment. And when they see that maybe things changed as the pandemic on, they don't want to engage with that. So I hope that is a lasting contribution. And I hope that in 3 to 5 years, I'm not saying none of those papers like looked at the whole of 2020. So we'll see.
Good for you. All right, Karol, anything?
Yeah, well, I basically have to say that if I hope for one lasting like effect of this paper is that people take the message or believe our results, that whatever you do has also lasting impact, that it's important to make decisions about recovery packages and greening them to actually because it's important in the long run. So if everything goes bad, well, or even if it goes bad, if we don't do the correct or green enough recovery packages, I hope at least in this case some people will say, but this guy told you so 3 years ago.
Very
But I
good.
hope for the other result. Yeah.
Thanks, Uli. Thank you.
Well, it might be more likely that we can, with the big agency in my back, I can say, but Irina told you so, you know. No, I really do hope that, well, actually two things. I hope that the discussion will be a bit more, and also our modeling will be a bit more influenced by the micro details, such as Dylan's question. What, you know, behavior do you actually assume in your modeling? So I think this dialogue is totally crucial, and we should not, you know, stay in each other's micro or macroeconometric world, but ever now and then talk to, and that's what I really like about this conference. And I share Karol's hope that we will be seeing some more green-oriented, climate change mitigation-oriented investment. However, I have to make the claim that an area where we also need a lot of investment might be adaptation. And that is also a lot overlooked. So I would like to bring that a bit more to also the academic table. I mean, adaptation is boring. It's basically, you know, you just build a dike. So there is not much academic discussion going on in that field. So it's a bit overlooked.
Okay, good, thank you. Ekaterini, what do you think will last?
Yes, I think again the need for green recovery packages in general in another crisis in the future, for example.
Okay, good. All right. Well, if there's nothing else, I would like to thank all of the speakers for wonderful presentations and papers. There you go. Congratulations. I would also like to thank Marc-Olivier and Felix for a little minute or two, we were told. I was told anyways. There you go. Wonderful. For hosting us so well. Thank you to the audience for being there. And thank you, everybody, for choosing to come to participate in the IAEE's first online conference. Thanks to everybody. Have a great conference. It's been a pleasure being here with you this last almost 2 hours. Thank you.
And thanks to you, Andre, for
Thank you, Andre.
a wonderful chair. Very lively.
Thank
Thanks
you.
a lot.
Thank you.
And in the morning.
Just a last thing for me. So first, thanks Andre for being the chairman. It was really pleasant, and I really